When he spoke, it was as if he strained his words through gravel. The illegitimate son of a Bavarian servant girl, he was short and burly and looked like a man who depended for his livelihood on slaughtering pigs on a farm, which he did as a youth, or cutting meat at the butcher's, which he did after his discharge from the army at the end of the Great War, until he joined the SS in 1928 and became Adolf Hitler's chauffeur and bodyguard. 5 years later, he organized and commanded the Führer's household troops, the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and in the summer of 1934 acted as chief executioner in Hitler's notorious purge of Nazi ranks, which became known as the Night of the Long Knives. He commanded the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler as a regiment in France in 1940, then headed it as a brigade in Greece and finally in Russia as a division, renamed the 1st SS Panzer Division. He was commanding an SS Panzer Corps in Normandy in the summer of 1944 when the cabal of army officers tried to kill the Führer. Hitler promptly made him head of a newly formed Panzer Army, but that command disintegrated in the defeat in Normandy and the retreat to the West Wall, whereupon Hitler designated him to rebuild the SS Panzer divisions, command the 6th Panzer Army, and make the main effort in the offensive through the Ardennes. While admitting the man's personal bravery, the German army's generals despised him. His World War I rank of sergeant attached to him perpetually in the minds of the aristocratic members of the German General Staff. He was, said von Rundstedt, decent but stupid. To senior army commanders, he had at most the ability to command a division, which was why Model and von Rundstedt arranged to have the experienced and capable Fritz Kramer assigned as his chief of staff. He was also sinister and ruthless. In Russia, when he learned that the Russians had murdered 6 of his troopers, he ordered all Russians captured over the next 3 days to be shot, and more than 4,000 died. By late 1944, he was drinking too much, seldom actually drunk, but often close to it. By that time also, he had come to decry his Führer's rash and clumsy interference with battlefield command, which explained his conniving to alter Hitler's plan for the 6th Panzer Army's crossings of the Meuse, so that if the offensive failed, his army would be in a position to implement the small solution. Yet the man was careful to conceal his discontent from the Führer, and to Hitler none of his shortcomings mattered. He had been loyal since that night long ago in 1923, when Hitler had attempted to seize power in the Feldherrnhalle in Munich and failed. Hitler knew that the troops adored the man, that they would die for him, and Hitler was convinced that he, above all others, could be trusted. That was why Hitler chose Sepp Dietrich as the one to lead the beloved SS Panzer divisions to victory and save the Third Reich. As befitted the force making the main effort, the 6th Panzer Army was by far the strongest of the 3 armies attacking in the Ardennes. Dietrich had 3 corps headquarters, 5 parachute and Volksgrenadier divisions, 4 SS Panzer divisions counting attached separate tank and assault gun battalions, 800 tanks and assault guns, and more artillery and Nebelwerfers than the 5th Panzer and 7th Armies combined, an awesome 1,000 pieces. With 2 Volksgrenadier divisions, the 67th Corps was to attack on both sides of Monschau to get onto the Haute Fagne, the high moors just beyond the frontier, there to join von der Heydt's parachutists and the big Jags Tigers with 128 guns in blocking American reinforcements. South of Monschau, after a parachute and 2 Volksgrenadier divisions achieved penetrations, 2 SS Panzer divisions of the 1st SS Panzer Corps were to make the main thrust in the vicinity of the twin villages of Krinkelt-Rocherath and through the northern reaches of the Losheim Gap. 2 more SS Panzer divisions under another SS Panzer Corps were to constitute a second wave, and most of Skorzeny's brigade was to operate in support of Dietrich's army. Roads were, of course, vital to swift advance by the German armour. None of the roads in the sector to be traversed by the SS Panzer divisions was ideal, but the planners designated 5 as adequate. 2 emerged from the Losheim Gap, while the other 3 in the vicinity of Krinkelt-Rocherath crossed a broad expanse of high ground that the Americans called the Elsenborn Ridge. Since the network of through roads was so limited, it was vital that the SS Panzer commanders adhere strictly to the routes assigned them, so vital that Hitler invoked his pet tactic of demanding compliance upon pain of death. To fail to obtain use of any of the 5 roads would impose a severe strain on the execution of the plan. To fail to gain as many as 3 could well be disastrous. Not that anybody expected any difficulty, for all knew that their adversary was inexperienced and vastly overextended. At either end of the 6th Panzer Army's jump-off line, there was only a cavalry reconnaissance squadron, and in between, holding a 20-mile front, the 99th Infantry Division. Even as the German troops crept through the snow and darkness on the night of December 15th to their attack positions, they and their commanders were still unaware that close behind the 99th Division was the 2D Infantry Division. What Dietrich did soon learn was that two elements of his plan had already gone awry. One of the Volksgrenadier divisions that was supposed to attack at Monschau had been unable to break free from defensive positions farther north, so that the 67th Corps would have only a single division. Nor was there to be any help from von der Heydt's parachutists, at least not as intended, before the attack started. Some of the trucks carrying the parachutists to the airfields from which their planes were to take off ran out of gasoline before they got there. By 10 p.m., when the planes were scheduled to take off, only 400 out of 1,200 parachutists had arrived. There would be no airborne attack that night. Nowhere along the Ardennes front was the German artillery preparation more intense, more spectacular than in the sector of the 6th Panzer Army. To CPL Rudi Frubeiser of the 3D Parachute Division, it was an earth-shaking inferno. To Tech, Sergeant Ben Narocki of the 99th Division's 393D Infantry, it seemed that all hell broke loose. The ground shook. The operations officer of the 394th Infantry, Major William B. Kempton, called it thunderous. For PFC Thor Ronningen of the 395th Infantry, who was asleep in a foxhole in Hofen, close to Monschau, it was a terrifying experience to wake up to the crash of the artillery and the ear-splitting scream of the rockets. The ground shook like a bowl of jello, and Major Gunther Holtz, commander of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division's Tank Destroyer Battalion, said that the earth seemed to break open. A hurricane of iron and fire went down on the enemy positions with a deafening noise. We old soldiers had seen many a heavy barrage, but never before anything like this. In Hofen, the shelling crumbled many of the buildings, filling the streets with debris, and set some of the houses on fire, illuminating the foggy night with a lurid glow. Along the rest of the 99th Division's line, where most of the defensive positions were within or on the edge of fir forests, shells exploded in the treetops, knocking off big limbs and spraying the forest with jagged metal. Yet even though the overall effect was awesome, the damage to the defenders was minimal. Wire communications went out almost everywhere, but so widely spaced were the positions that many of the shells fell on undefended sectors, and elsewhere the men were well dug in, their foxholes roofed with logs. At the road junction of Wallerscheid, where the 2D Division was attacking, there was no shelling, for the Germans planned no attack in that sector. Nor was there any artillery fire on the town of Monschau. One of the most picturesque towns in all Germany, Monschau was in peacetime a favourite of honeymooners, and so the word went of Adolf Hitler himself. Set in a deep gorge astride the upper reaches of the Roer River at that point, more like a mountain stream gurgling over a rock-strewn bottom, the town consisted of charming medieval buildings, their upper stories of white stucco and exposed wood framing ranged along cobblestone streets little wider than sidewalks. Some said it was model, others Hitler himself had ordered that there was to be no shelling of Monschau. The artillery was still firing when the big searchlights lit the sky with a milky glow. If the light helped the Germans in their attack, it also helped the Americans in their defense, particularly at three places where the attackers closely followed the artillery preparation. There were only 3 places where that happened along the entire front, against the 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron at Monschau, against a lone battalion of the 395th Infantry at Hofen, and against 2 battalions of the 393D Infantry dug in, where 2 woods trails emerged from the forest almost due east of crinkled Rocherath to join a highway following the trace of the Belgian-German frontier, a road the Americans called the International Highway to PFC. Bernie Mackay, whose Company B 393D Infantry faced that highway, it seemed there were thousands of Germans. He and the men with him could see them against the skyline as they came over the hill. It seemed like they were coming right at us and for some reason ignoring everybody else. At Hofen, the Germans approached in swarms, moving forward at a slow, methodical walk, and at Monschau, men of the 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron saw shadowy forms plodding toward them. With a round in the chamber of every rifle and machine gun, and with 37 guns on the light tanks loaded with canister, the men waited for the Germans to reach the barbed wire in front of their positions. As elsewhere in the Ardennes, the defensive line around Monschau was thin. The cavalry's strongest positions, including a line of 50 machine guns culled from jeeps and armoured cars, were northwest of the town behind a railroad track. They had been emplaced there to deny access to the town of Mutzenich on high ground behind Monschau. For Mutzenich more than Monschau was the key to access to the highway leading onto the Haute-Fagne. Immediately north of Monschau, the defensive line swung to the other side of the railroad in order to deny entry to Monschau, while at the southern edge of the town, where a road cut across the deep gorge of the Roer, the cavalrymen had a roadblock backed up by light tanks. The squadron had direct support from the 62D Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, and the pieces of 2 corps artillery battalions were within easy firing range. At Hofen, the commander of the 3D Battalion, 395th Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel McClernand Butler, had managed to hold only a single rifle platoon as a reserve. Even so, his line was thin, but having defended the town since early November, the men were well dug in, and their fields of fire across ground rising steeply toward the positions were excellent. Butler had the support of a battalion of the 99th Division's artillery, and 2 nights earlier a company of towed guns of the 612th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 2D Division, had arrived in Hofen in order to be ready to provide support when the men of the 2D Division broke through at Wallerscheid and fanned out to other objectives in front of Hofen. The crews dug in their 12 3-inch guns and camouflaged them with bed sheets. Despite the small size of the defending force, the Germans had no such numerical superiority as they had elsewhere in the Ardennes, primarily because of the failure of one of the 2 Volksgrenadier divisions to arrive, but also because the other, the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, was depleted. 1 battalion had yet to arrive, another had been siphoned off the day before to help repel the attack by the 78th Division, a part of the attempt to take the Roer River dams, and yet a third, having briefly held the pillboxes at Wallerscheid, had been relieved there the night before by the division's replacement battalion, less than an hour before the 2D Division's 9th Infantry carried the position and would be unable to reach the line of departure for an attack before daylight on the 16th. Instead of 2 divisions with 14 infantry battalions, there was thus a single division with only 4 battalions immediately available. The Germans struck the cavalry on either side of the gorge of the Roer River in front and just to the north of Monschau. As a German set off a trip flare, the waiting defenders opened fire as one. When the cavalry commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. O'Brien, called on the commander of the 405th Field Artillery Group, Carl Oscar A. Axelson, for help, Axelson decided, even though the super-secret proximity fuse had yet to be released officially, that he would use it. The shells bursting in the air above the approaching Germans were terrifying and devastating. As 60 mortars fired illumination rounds, the cavalrymen could see the Germans falling back in headlong retreat. Exulting in that success, Colonel O'Brien was nevertheless conscious of the meagre strength of a cavalry reconnaissance squadron and early asked for reinforcements. In response, the commander of the V Corps, General Gero, sent the 146th Engineer Combat Battalion, whose men arrived soon after nightfall and began to dig in before Mutzenich, the gateway to the road to the Hautes-Fagnes and to Eupen, where Gero had his headquarters. At Hofen, meanwhile, the defenders waited as the men of 2 German battalions trudged up the steep hill toward their positions through the murky illumination of the artificial moonlight. They were less than 200 yards from the American foxholes when every weapon the battalion possessed opened fire and practically swept most of the Germans away. Yet so persistent was the assault that in at least 3 cases, dying men pitched forward into the foxholes. Only in the center of the elongated town at the seam between Companies Y and K was there any German success. There some 30 or so got into the houses, but as the others fell back, harassed at every step by the towed tank destroyers firing high-explosive rounds, the infiltrators held on for less than an hour. When it was over, at least 100 Germans were dead, possibly more, and 19 captured. The contrast in American casualties was striking. 4 killed, 4 missing, 7 wounded. If the 6th Panzer Army was to break through at Monschau-Hofen and secure its northern flank on the high moors beyond, General Dietrich obviously would have to come up with greater strength for the 67th Corps. Yet success or failure for the 6th Panzer Army rested ultimately not with the 67th Corps, but with the 1st SS Panzer Corps, a few miles to the south along the approaches to Krinkelt-Roscherath and a cluster of other frontier villages, and in the Losheim Gap. And there the Germans had the same great numerical superiority they possessed at most other places. Striking to gain access to two woods trails leading to Krinkelt-Roscherath, the entire 277th Volksgrenadier Division, built around remnants of an infantry division that had been virtually destroyed in Normandy, was destined to hit only 3 American battalions, while a little farther south the entire 12th Volksgrenadier Division was to hit but 2 battalions. Once past the frontier forests and villages, in the process opening up routes for the SS Panzer divisions, the 2 Volksgrenadier divisions were to cross the Elsenborn Ridge and swing northwest to block in the direction of the Hautes-Fagnes. The task of opening other routes for the panzers farther south in the Losheim Gap fell to the 3D Parachute Division, which was then to follow Kampfgruppe Piper closely, but peel troops off to face north and protect Piper's supply route. On the American side, the commander of the 393d Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Gene D. Scott, who had been ordered to demonstrate by fire in support of the attack by the 2D Division and the 395th Infantry, seized the opportunity to better his positions. He decided to attack with a portion of his 3D Battalion to take a dominating forested hill. The Rathburg American troops called it Rat Hill, just off the battalion's north flank. The 3D Battalion had accomplished that handily, but the added defensive responsibility had absorbed all but a platoon of the reserve company. Thus, there was scant backup for a line of foxholes extending more than 2 miles, all of the line inside dense fir forest except for a short stretch where the holes were on the fringe of the forest, looking out over the international highway. The foxholes constituted more a series of platoon strongpoints than a solid line, and the critical point was that at which the woods trail leading 4 miles back to Krinkelt-Roscherath joined the highway. Beyond the international highway, the Germans still held the pillboxes of the west wall, and open draws led up to the highway from German villages behind the pillboxes. The critical junction of the woods trail and the highway was the responsibility of Company K under Captain Stephen K. Plume. Yet the main thrust against Plume's company hit not there but along the woods line a little to the south. There, 2 battalions of Germans were almost on top of Company K foxholes, just as the artillery preparation lifted, and the outcome dramatically illustrated the advantage the Germans forfeited at most other places by failing to follow their artillery fire closely. Except for the platoon astride the woods road, the first rush overwhelmed all of Company K. If the men of the remaining platoon were to survive, they had to fall back, and Captain Plume ordered them to withdraw immediately to the company command post. Because communications were out, it was close to 8 a.m. before the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Jack G. Allen, learned of Company K fate. Since the collapse jeopardized Company L on the other side of the woods trail, Allen told that company to fall back to defend the battalion command post and soon directed Company 1, a mile away atop Rat Hill, to do the same. The men of Company I had to fight to get there, but by noon a defensive position encompassing the battalion command post was forming, based in part on old positions dug when the battalion had a reserve company. On the German side, the commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, Generalleutnant der Waffen SS Hermann Priess, was markedly upset by the failure of the Volksgrenadiers to achieve a quick penetration so that the 12th SS Panzer Division could get going on the drive to the Meuse. Around noon he ordered a battalion of SS Panzer Grenadiers to help, but that failed to carry the 3D Battalion's position. The SS Panzer Grenadiers did push down the woods trail as far as the deep cut of a creek called the Jansbach, thereby succeeding in blocking the 3D Battalion's only road to the rear. There was no question but that Colonel Allen and his men were fighting for their lives. The regimental commander, Colonel Scott, could send no help, for what had been his reserve battalion had moved on December 13th to help in the 395th Infantry's attack in support of the 2D Division. But early in the afternoon, the commander of the 99th Division, Major General Walter E. Lauer, released a company from his only reserve, a battalion of the 394th Infantry, to go to Allen's assistance. Allen sent guides to the rear to lead the company forward over fire breaks, thereby avoiding the Germans on the road. As night fell, the German pressure decreased, for German commanders had to reorganize their units in the face of heavy, even crippling losses. Before the attack, regiments of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division had been critically short of officers and non-commissioned officers. Hardly a single frontline company had more than a single officer, and as those leaders tried to inspire their inexperienced troops by example, they had been among the first to fall. The Germans probably lost as many as 300 men, for when a thaw came at last to the Ardennes in the spring, local inhabitants found the draws leading up to the international highway thick with German bodies. American losses were also heavy, some 300 either killed, wounded or captured, 3/4 of them from Company K, including the commander, Captain Plume, who was captured. Just to the south, Major Matthew L. Legler's 1st Battalion, 393d Infantry, underwent the same kind of numerically overwhelming assault as did the 3D Battalion. Yet most of Legler's positions were at the edge of the forest, overlooking the international highway and generally open ground, so that the men of the 1st Battalion had an advantage not shared by their neighbours. With machine guns, mortars and artillery, they exploited excellent fields of fire to exact a heavy toll. Not one German got inside the American positions, and within an hour the assault was at a halt, under strong pressure to obtain a quick penetration for the waiting tanks of the 12th SS Panzer Division. The commander of the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, Karl Wilhelm Wirbig, committed his reserve regiment. At 8 a.m. that regiment and the survivors of the other attacked behind a heavy concentration of artillery fire and rockets. Again, many a German fell, particularly non-commissioned officers and the few junior officers who were herding the troops forward, but the sheer weight of numbers soon began to tell. The first breakthrough came on the right where the international highway entered the woods and where, in order to cover the second woods trail leading back to Krinkelt-Rocherath, most of Company C positions had to be within the forest with limited fields of fire. A half hour after the renewed assault began, 2 of Company C platoons fell back, but the Germans failed to pursue their advantage, seemingly content merely to occupy the foxholes and loot them. An hour later, 2 of Company B platoons also caved in. At that point, Major Legler committed his reserve company to restore Company B positions. Employing marching fire, the men retook most of the foxholes, yet Legler needed help to reoccupy Company C positions. When he appealed to the regimental commander, Colonel Scott, all Scott could provide was the mine platoon from the anti-tank company, composed of a lieutenant and 25 men. When they reached the battalion command post, the operations officer, Captain Lawrence H. Duffin, was waiting with 13 men from the headquarters company. Taking command of the little force less than a full-strength rifle platoon, Duffin led the men up the trail, soon to find Company C command post under attack. Fixing bayonets, the men charged. They killed 28 Germans and the rest fell back to the foxholes they had captured earlier. With Company C survivors, Captain Duffin formed a new line based on the command post. By midday, the 1st Battalion, 393d Infantry, still maintained a fairly cohesive defence, but the battalion had lost 400 men, more than half its foxhole strength. The Germans were nevertheless slow to continue the attack, a reflection of their own heavy losses. With the coming of darkness, the Germans took advantage of the gaps they had forged on the flanks of both the 1st and 3D battalions to send strong patrols, some composed of more than 50 men, to probe deep into the forest. Sometimes the Germans called out in English in an effort to trap the unwary. Sometimes they fired their burp guns wildly, seemingly on the off chance that they might hit somebody. For men of both American battalions, it was a cold, miserable night. Anybody who slept did so only fitfully, and if anybody ate, he had only frozen C or K rations, for there could be no fires. Medical officers and aid men in both battalions tried to make the wounded as comfortable as possible, but both aid stations were overflowing. Through much of the day, medics of the 1st Battalion had been able to take out most of their wounded by jeep, but nobody dared make the run after nightfall. Evacuation of the wounded from the 3D Battalion ended early when the Germans cut the woods trail at the Jansbach, just to the south of Major Legler's battalion, the northernmost unit of the 394th Infantry. The 2D Battalion had also become embroiled with the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, but against nothing like the heavy odds faced by the 2 battalions of the 393d Infantry. All that the German division commander, Colonel Wiebig, had left to throw against that battalion, located mostly within the woods alongside the international highway, was the division's Fusilier Battalion. The men of that battalion were slow to follow up the artillery preparation and paid the inevitable consequences. Mortar and artillery concentrations zeroed in earlier rained down on them, while machine gunners and barmen unleashed a torrent of small arms fire. In less than half an hour, the Germans were falling back. They tried again in mid-morning with the help of 3 assault guns, but a heavy concentration of fire from the 155 guns of the 99th Division's General Support Artillery Battalion erupted around the vehicles and sent them scurrying to the rear. Some of the Fusiliers nevertheless worked their way within hand grenade distance of one of the platoons of Company E, but since all men of the platoon had overhead cover on their holes, the platoon leader, Tech Sergeant Fred Wallace, called for artillery fire on top of the positions. Most of the Germans were killed, and such few as survived were quickly rounded up. Except for occasional shelling, that was all that happened on December 16th to the 394th Infantry's 2D Battalion. The men were proud of their stand. All their positions were intact and the casualties few. Yet most were aware that something serious, they knew not what was happening to their neighbours off either flank, and at the command post deep in the forest, the battalion staff had to cope with a special problem. Their commander had gone to pieces, cowering in a corner of one of the log huts, his head between his knees. To anyone with a map, it would be obvious why the Germans made no major thrust against the 394th Infantry's 2D Battalion, for in rear of the battalion, the only passage through the forest was over fire breaks and muddy logging trails. But just a few miles farther south, 2 paved roads and a railroad led into the 99th Division's positions, and there waited Kampfgruppe Piper, the tank-heavy task force of the 1st SS Panzer Division, ready to begin the thrust on which Adolf Hitler's principal hope rode for quick seizure of crossings over the Meuse River. There, too, the entire 12th Volksgrenadier Division was to make the penetration and was to have some help from adjacent troops of the 3D Parachute Division. To defend against that formidable force, there were only 2 US battalions of the 394th Infantry, one of them designated as the Division Reserve and Shorter Company and the regiment's Y and R platoon. For the Germans, the 2 roads were crucial. The main road led up a gently rising incline from Losheim to an intersection with the international highway at Losheimer Graben, a crossroads settlement consisting of a customs house and a few other buildings. It then passed through dense forest to open country and a cluster of villages and towns, Hunningen, Muringen, Bullingen, and Butgenbach, continuing westward to Malmedy and beyond. The other road, just south of the railroad, also had a connection from Losheim and ran through the Belgian frontier village of Lanzerath. From there it passed a cluster of buildings known as Buchholz Farm and a nearby railroad station, which American troops called Buchholz Station, and on to the west by way of the village of Honsfeld. The main road through Losheimer Graben was to be used by a column of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the other by Kampfgruppe Piper. Wilhelm Osterhold was a slight, wiry man with a black moustache, known among the troops of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division's 48th Regiment, as one who believed that a regimental commander led his troops from the forward ranks. A career soldier, Osterhold had entered the army not to accommodate any military bent, but in search of refuge from National Socialism. When Hitler and the Nazis came to power in the 1930s, Osterhold's father, a staunchly anti-Nazi representative in the Reichstag, had been arrested for distributing anti-national socialist literature and sent to a concentration camp. That left a black mark against every member of the family, and the only way young Osterhold could see of evading it was to submerge himself in the army. It had proven to be a good choice, for Osterhold knew that on at least one occasion Nazi authorities had raised questions about him, but by that time he had become an officer with a record, and his superiors covered for him. Colonel Osterhold's 48th Regiment was to make the 12th Volksgrenadier Division's main effort, its first goal to seize the crossroads at Losheimer Graben and open a path for a column of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Like other units of the division, Osterhold's regiment had lost heavily in late September after arriving hurriedly from the Eastern Front to halt the American drive near Aachen, and in the process earning the honorific Volksgrenadier in the days when the name had some meaning. The replacements who had only recently joined the regiment were young and inexperienced, but hospital returnees who had fought in Russia had joined the ranks of veteran non-commissioned officers and junior officers. For the assault, Osterhold had the support not only of all his division's artillery, but also of 2 Volksartillery Corps. He also had 1575 assault guns, while another regiment of his division was to make a supporting attack up the line of the railroad close by on the south. To Colonel Osterhold, as to the other soldiers at the front that morning, the artillery preparation seemed awesome, but as he and his men soon discovered, it did little damage. To Osterhold, the fire plan appeared to have been drawn up far away in Berlin. In a fan-shaped defense of the crossroads, the Americans of the 1st Battalion, 394th Infantry, got their first indication of the enemy's approach soon after the artillery fire lifted, with the appearance in the diffused glare from the enemy searchlights of a US Jeep on the road from Losheim. The Jeep approached a concealed outpost containing a 57 anti-tank gun, but the crew of the anti-tank gun was so stunned to see an American vehicle that nobody fired. Turning around, the Jeep raced back to Losheim, then reappeared a short time later, preceding a 75 assault gun. The crew of the anti-tank gun let the Jeep pass but opened fire on the assault gun. A first round knocked off a track, a second penetrated the hull, and a third set the assault gun on fire. Only the commander, a lieutenant, got out, and he was badly wounded. Men in positions a little farther up the road killed the occupants of the Jeep with small arms fire. Because the going was slow up steep wooded draws which the Germans had to use to reach other portions of the 1st Battalion's positions, it was well into the morning before the defenders saw any of the enemy, but when the Germans came, they came in strength. 2 battalions of the 48th Regiment hit the seam between 2 American companies in the thick forest northeast of Losheimer Graben. Then one of the battalions swung down the line of Company B foxholes in the direction of the crossroads, taking the positions in flank. With the attacking Germans was Osterhold himself, frustrated because he was unable to establish radio contact with his supporting artillery, and when he finally did get through to call for fire, the artillery fell short on his other battalion, disrupting that part of the attack. The assault against Company B nevertheless continued, so that by early afternoon the company had lost 60 men, including the leader of an attached heavy machine gun platoon, Tech. Sergeant Edward Dolenk, last seen firing his machine gun with 20 or more Germans piled in front of it. Because the other half of the German thrust had been disrupted by the misdirected artillery fire, the men of Company C were free to try to re-establish their neighbouring companies' positions, but with little success. Night was falling when Colonel Osterhold and one of his battalions reached the edge of the woods overlooking Losheimer Graben. Osterhold was reluctant to continue further without assured fire support from either artillery or assault guns. In the woods on the other side of Losheimer Graben, what appeared to be 2 platoons of Germans bounced off positions of Company A astride the international highway and worked their way toward the crossroads. Only the men of Company D 81 mortar platoon, their mortars dug in around a farmhouse 100 yards short of the crossroads, stood in the way. The Germans were almost on top of one of the mortar positions before the crew spotted them across a firebreak no more than 15 yards away. Looking out from the mortar position, PFC. Robert Newborough saw a German soldier holding a potato masher hand grenade, the first German soldier Newborough had ever seen close up. The German was just as startled to see him, Newborough decided, as he was to see the German. Newborough was debating what to do when his sergeant called by telephone for the other mortars to fire almost on top of his position. Elevating the tubes to almost 90 degrees, the mortarmen in the other positions opened fire. Once the shells began to burst, the surviving Germans fled. Newborough, as he put it, did not know where and did not care. As night came, the 1st Battalion still held most of its original positions, except for the penetration that had split Company B. Yet the commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Douglas, doubted how much longer he could hold on. Along the main road leading from Losheim to Losheimer Graben, he was disturbingly aware he had only about 50 men left, a heterogeneous group from various units that had coalesced around a platoon leader, First Lieutenant Dewey Plankers. If the Germans launched a strong thrust up the highway, that little group would be hard-pressed to stop it. With the authority of the commander of the 394th Infantry, Colonel Don Riley, Douglas early that evening called on 4 platoons from the 3D Battalion, ostensibly the Division Reserve, to dig back up positions astride the highway behind Losheimer Graben. Yet by usurping those platoons, Douglas raised the possibility of the men of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division taking him in the rear, for even before the Volksgrenadiers had hit his battalion, they had struck the supposedly reserve positions of the 3D Battalion off his flank. And even though the Germans had absorbed considerable losses, they were still there. Constituting the 99th Division's only reserve, the 3D Battalion, 394th Infantry, commanded by Major Norman A. Moore, was located in and around the little rural railroad depot that the Americans called Buchholz Station. Because one of the rifle companies had been sent as a reserve for the 395th Infantry's attack, and was to be committed later on the 16th to help Colonel Allen's battalion of the 393d Infantry, Moore had only 2 rifle companies, one of which he established at Buchholz Station, for even though the battalion was supposed to be in reserve, nobody else was defending the line of the railroad, which ran through a deep cut in the forested hills along the frontier and was an obvious route of advance should the Germans attack. Not that Moore or anybody else in the 3D Battalion was expecting an attack any more than anybody else in the 99th Division or elsewhere in the Ardennes. Indeed, on the morning of the 16th, once the unusual phenomenon of German shelling had passed, and nothing else had happened other than the appearance of a strange luminous glow on the horizon, the men of Company L began to prepare for breakfast. Their company kitchen having arrived at the position only the night before, they were anticipating their first full hot meal in several days. The chow line had yet to form when somebody noticed a group of just over 50 men walking through the fog along either side of the railroad track. Somebody shouted, "Who were those guys?" One man thought they might be men of the company's weapons platoon coming for breakfast, but he yelled at them anyway to halt. When someone in the approaching group began shouting orders in German, First Sergeant Elmer Klug fired with his carbine. For the other men of Company L, that was all the signal they needed. Everybody within sight of the German column opened fire. The Germans scattered, some into the woods on either side of the railroad, others to the protection of a freight car on the tracks. CPL George F. Bodnar managed to fire 4 bazooka rockets into the freight car, but was unable to get close enough to assess the results. Constituting the advance guard of the leading battalion of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division's 27th Regiment, the Germans had obviously been surprised, but their commander quickly fed in reinforcements. For the rest of the morning, fighting around the station and in the adjacent woods raged at close quarters, while Major Moore brought up his remaining rifle company to help. Some of the Germans reached the roundhouse close to the station, whereupon Tech Sergeant Savino Travellini, leader of the battalion's anti-tank platoon, fired enough rockets from a bazooka to flush them, then cut them down with fire from his rifle when they tried to escape. As German pressure eased around noon, Company L cooks prepared to serve the long-delayed breakfast, but shells from German mortars and artillery rained down in such numbers that the meal was soon forgotten. The men of the 3D Battalion, 394th Infantry, were to get nothing to eat that day. When the early night of the Ardennes winter closed in around the little railroad station, American troops still held the station and positions on either side, thus blocking the nearby road leading from Lanzerath to Honsfeld, and a woods trail leading from the station into the rear of the 1st Battalion's positions at Losheim Graben. Yet the defences were flimsy at best, made the more so after the regimental commander authorised sending the 4 platoons more than half the 3D Battalion's remaining riflemen to back up the positions at Losheim Graben. That prompted Major Moore to abandon the railroad station in order to put greater strength on the Honsfeld road, meaning only 2 platoons and the trail. In the day's fighting, the Germans had lost at least 50 killed and 30 captured, about equal to American losses. Yet to the little cluster of Americans who remained, it was obvious that the Germans would be back. As far as they knew, unless a small band of men of the 394th Infantry 1 and R platoon was still holding out nearby on a wooded hillock overlooking the village of Lanzerath, they were all that stood in the way to prevent the Germans from turning the south flank of the 99th Division. Lyle Joseph Book Jr. was anticipating nothing special for his birthday, which was December 17th, but he had taken note that it was an important one, his 21st. Only 2 others among the 17 men in the I&R platoon which Book commanded were younger. Yet Book already had 6 years of military service behind him. In his hometown of St. Louis, he had enlisted in the National Guard at the age of 14, and at 18 he had completed officer candidate school at Fort Benning and been commissioned a second lieutenant. After assignment to the 99th Division, he had attracted the attention of the 394th Infantry's intelligence officer, Major Robert L. Criss, who picked him to command the Regimental 1 and R platoon. Its combat mission was just what the letters I and R stood for, intelligence and reconnaissance, which meant mainly patrolling. 6 days earlier, the regimental commander, Colonel Riley, had ordered Lieutenant Buch to go with his platoon to the vicinity of Lanzerath and pick a defensive position to serve as an outpost for the 99th Division's south flank. There was nothing on that flank, Riley knew, but the 14th Cavalry Group with a single cavalry reconnaissance squadron in the line, and the sector, Riley also knew, was the historic Losheim Gap. Any force penetrating into the gap might turn north to trap not only the 394th Infantry, but the entire 99th Division. A single I and R platoon could hardly be expected to stop a strong thrust, but it could give the alarm. What Buch and his men found was a ready-made outpost. Some 2 months earlier, before the 4th Division, which had made the attack that captured the nearby Schnee-Eifel, had left for another assignment, a battalion of that division's 12th Infantry had dug the foxholes to protect a flank abutting on the Losheim Gap. To Lieutenant Buch, it seemed an excellent position. The foxholes were covered with logs and looked out from the edge of a fir forest onto a field sloping down to the highway that passed through Lanzerath, an extension of the international highway. Not only were there good fields of fire onto the highway, but also onto a road junction a few hundred yards outside Lanzerath, where a road branched off and led past Buchholz's farm to Honsfeld. When the weather was clear, you could look over the tops of the houses in Lanzerath into a wide valley beyond, where lay the village of Losheim and the Dragon's Teeth and pillboxes of the Siegfried Line. So ideal was the position as an outpost that Colonel Riley ignored the fact that it lay just outside the 99th Division's southern boundary and told Buch to occupy it. As Buch and his men moved in, they established contact with the crews of the 4-towed guns of the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion and their supporting reconnaissance troops, who constituted the 14th Cavalry Group's little strongpoint in Lanzerath. Although Buch was aware that such a small force as his could hardly be expected to hold at length, he was pleased with the commanding nature of his position, and he congratulated himself that he and his men had managed to accumulate more weapons than normally allotted an I and R platoon. To augment their M1 rifles, they had scrounged several bars, 2.30 caliber machine guns, and a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a jeep. The night of December 15th, Lyle Buch was wary. Every night since moving into the position, there had been strange noises rising from the valley beyond, as if heavy vehicles were moving about. Did that portend what the intelligence officer Major Criss had warned him about, that there might be a German reaction to the attack underway to seize the Ruhr River dams? Taking no chances, he ordered every man to stay alert throughout the night. Buch and all his men were thus awake when at 5:30 a.m. the valley behind Losheim came alive with pinpricks of light on the horizon that soon turned into flickers. There followed the thunder of what seemed to be hundreds of guns, then the crash of shells on Lanzerath, and then right on top of the I and R platoon's positions. Despite their foxhole cover, the men breathed with relief only after the barrage passed on beyond them in the direction of Buchholz's farm. Not long after that, the sky lit up with a strange glow, made all the more eerie by a heavy fog. A first cousin of Sanny Schur, in whose house some of the reconnaissance troops supporting the tank destroyers in Lanzerath lodged, Adolf Schur, lived with his parents and an older brother at the northern edge of the village, just down the hill from the woods line, where 6 days earlier a small group of Americans had moved in. At 16 years of age, Adolf was enjoying his friendship with the Americans in Lanzerath. They gave him and his family good-tasting canned food, sugar and real coffee, and they taught him some English words. He was sure they were swear words and vulgarities, for the soldiers laughed when he repeated them, but Adolf liked the attention that afforded him. Early in the morning of December 16th, when the shelling began, Adolf took refuge with his family in the cellar, but when it had stopped, he hurried upstairs, eager to see what might happen. Not long after daylight, he saw his American friends hitching their big guns to their half-tracks and heading north out of the village. That must mean the Germans were coming, but Adolf found it odd that the Americans would leave without firing a shot. There was no time to determine whether the little group of Americans 100 yards away at the woods line on the hill was still there before German soldiers came marching up the road through the village. There was a line of men in the mottled uniforms of paratroopers on either side of the road, their rifles slung from their shoulders, not at all as if they expected trouble. A few dropped out of the column and entered the Schur's house, ostensibly looking for a drink of water, but when they spotted the sugar and American rations that Adolf's mother was saving for Christmas, they took them, then rejoined the column outside. Up on the hill, after recovering from the jolt of seeing the crews of the tank destroyers fleeing, Lieutenant Buch puzzled over why no German attack had followed the heavy artillery barrage. With 3 of his men, he went into Lanzerath and from the second story of a house, looked out over the valley toward Losheim. Despite the fog, he could make out streams of German troops marching up the road from Losheim in his direction. Hurrying back to the hilltop position, Buch radioed his regimental headquarters what he had seen and begged for artillery fire on the approaching Germans, but the officer with whom he spoke obviously thought Buch was out of his mind. No artillery fire followed. Turning to his men, Buch told them to get ready to fight. In view of the apparent size of the German force, most of the men wanted to withdraw, but Buch ordered them to hold. From their commanding position, Buch believed they could do heavy damage to the German column. The men were in their foxholes, their weapons trained across a snow-covered field onto the road below, when the first Germans emerged from the concealment of the barn attached to Adolf's house. Buch told the men to hold their fire. The first Germans, he reasoned, were probably an advance guard. He wanted to wait until the main body was in his men's sights. 100 had passed when there was a break in the column, then a group of 3 men alone. That, thought Buch, would be the command group. His runner, Private Sakanicus, one of the few men in the platoon who was younger than Buch, drew a bead on the 3, and Buch was about to give the order to shoot when a blonde-haired girl of about 13 emerged from a house beyond the road. Running to the 3 figures, she pointed uphill toward the I and R platoon's positions. Lest the child be killed, Buch hesitated. In that split second, one of the Germans yelled something and the column of paratroopers dived for the ditches on either side of the road. From the barn of his father's house, Adolf Schur was watching. "God damn," he muttered. The predictable attack by what turned out to be a battalion of the 3D Parachute Division's 9th Regiment soon followed. To Buch and his men, it seemed stupid. The paratroopers had no fire support except for some men firing from the ditches along the road, no mortars, no artillery, but still they tried to rush the 100 yards uphill across an open, snow-covered field to get at the American position. To many in the I and R platoon, it was a painful assignment to fire at them. They could see their faces, and they were only kids. The fire caught some of them trying to cross a barbed wire fence bisecting the field and left them hanging on the wire. All the while, Lieutenant Buch was appealing by radio to headquarters of the 394th Infantry for artillery support. An officer finally told him there would be no artillery, all the guns were preoccupied on other missions. "What shall we do then?" asked Buch. "Hold," the answer came back, "at all costs." Buch pondered what that meant. Hold until every man was dead. Around noon, a white flag appeared. The Germans wanted to evacuate their wounded. At Buch's order, the men held their fire, but no sooner was the task completed than the Germans returned to the assault just as before, frontal assault up the steep hill, by that time littered with German corpses. From beyond the road, light mortars coughed some support, but because of the overhead cover on the foxholes, the fire did little damage. In the barn next to the Schur's house, Adolf's brother Erich and his father Christoph came up from the cellar to join Adolf. Christoph had been a drummer in the Great War. "Now," he told his sons, "you can see what war is really like." Atop the hill, Lieutenant Buch was again on the radio to his regiment. He was reiterating the vain requests for artillery support when what sounded like an explosion in his ear knocked him to the ground. A burst of automatic fire had struck his radio, destroying it. Only stunned, Buch recovered quickly. Conscious that ammunition was running low, Buch told Sakanicus to take whoever wanted to withdraw and get out, but Sakanicus refused to go without Buch. "No," said Buch, "I have orders to hold at all costs."